This engine's block was made of sheet metal, not cast iron, stamped steel formed into pieces and fused together with copper inside a furnace, like a tin can built to explode 4,000 times a minute. It weighed less than 60 pounds. A grown man could lift it off the workbench and carry it across the shop under one arm. 4 cylinders, an overhead camshaft, 44 cubic inches of displacement, and about 26.5 horsepower out of a package smaller than a modern lawnmower engine. When it was new, nothing else in America looked remotely like it. During the war, tens of thousands of these engines ran flawlessly for the American military. Then, in peacetime, in the little cars it was finally built for, it began to rot from the inside out and destroy itself. This is the story of the Crosley Cobra, the strangest engine America ever put into mass production, and the man who bet an entire automobile company on it. A man who had already conquered radio, refrigerators, and professional baseball, and who was absolutely certain he could shrink the automobile the same way he had shrunk everything else he ever touched. He was right about almost everything. He was wrong about one thing, and that one thing was the block itself, the piece of engineering genius that made the whole car possible, and the hidden flaw that quietly dissolved the company from the inside. So how does an engine that won on a racetrack and served without complaint in a war zone end up helping to kill the company that built it? To answer that, we have to start with the most famous man in Cincinnati. In 1939, Powell Crosley Jr. is not a car man. He is an entire empire wearing a suit. If you owned a radio anywhere in America in the 1920s, there is a good chance Powell Crosley built it because he manufactured them cheaper than anyone else alive. He did not invent the radio. He did something that arguably mattered more. He drove the price down until an ordinary working family could actually afford to put one in the living room. Then, he built the transmitter to fill that living room. Station WLW in Cincinnati, at its peak, broadcast at 500,000 watts. That is 10 times the maximum power any American AM station is legally allowed to run today. It was so overwhelmingly powerful that people living in the surrounding countryside swore they could hear it humming through their bed springs, their gutters, and their barbed wire fences. They called it the nation's station, and on a clear night its signal reached most of the continent. He invented the shelf built into the refrigerator door, called it the shelvador, and sold it by the millions. He bought the Cincinnati Reds baseball team, and he pushed to put lights in the ballpark so that working people could finally watch a game after their shift instead of only on weekends. Whatever the product happened to be, the underlying pattern never changed. Take something expensive and exclusive, strip it down to its essentials, make it small, make it cheap, and then sell it to absolutely everyone. And when Powell Crosley looked at the American automobile in the 1930s, he saw the exact same opportunity he had already seized in radio. The cars of that era were enormous, heavy, thirsty machines. Crosley was convinced that America did not actually need all of that iron. He believed that most people, most of the time, simply needed to get across town and back home again. So he set out to build the anti-Detroit, a car so small, so light, and so cheap to run that it would do for personal transportation exactly what the affordable radio had done for entertainment. His first cars, built before the war, were tiny 2-cylinder machines. And here is a detail people rarely believe. He sold them in department stores. You could walk in and buy a Crosley automobile right next to the washing machines and the appliances. They were crude, they were widely mocked, and they never sold in the numbers he wanted. But Crosley had already learned the single most important lesson of his career decades earlier in the radio business. The product only wins if the engineering underneath it is genuinely better and not merely smaller. And to build the small car he truly wanted, he was going to need an engine that did not yet exist. He would eventually find it not in Detroit, and not in any car at all, but inside a wartime engineering program on the far side of the country. The engine that would come to define Crosley was never designed for a car in the first place. It came from an engineer named Lloyd Taylor, working out in California, who had been chasing one very specific and very difficult problem. How do you build a gasoline engine that makes real, usable power for its size, while weighing almost nothing at all? Every single pound becomes critical when your engine has to go into an aircraft, or a portable field generator, or a piece of equipment that a crew has to physically pick up and carry? Taylor's answer broke nearly every rule of how engines had always been built. An engine block, traditionally, is one massive single casting of iron. It is heavy on purpose because that iron has to contain thousands of controlled explosions every minute and absorb tremendous heat without cracking or warping. It is almost always the heaviest single part of the entire engine. Taylor asked a genuinely heretical question. What if you did not cast it at all? Instead, he took thin sheets of stamped steel, formed them into the shapes of the cylinders, the water passages, and the outer block, and then fused all of those separate pieces together using copper inside a high-temperature brazing furnace. The molten copper flowed into every joint and locked the entire assembly into one solid, sealed unit. Copper brazed. Take the first letters. CO for copper. BRA for brazed. Cobra. The result was almost impossible to believe for its day. A modern four-cylinder engine with an overhead camshaft that weighed less than 60 pounds complete. Competing engines making similar power weighed 3 or 4 times as much. It was a genuine work of engineering art. And during the Second World War, it proved exactly what it could do. The American military bought these little engines by the tens of thousands and put them straight to work as lightweight auxiliary power plants. They ran generators, they ran refrigeration units. They served in marine and dockside roles. Anywhere a crew needed a surprising amount of power out of something 2 men could lift, the brazed engine was the answer. And in that world, the Cobra was superb, because in military service, the engine lived what was essentially a charmed life. It ran in short, clearly defined bursts rather than for endless hours. It was maintained by trained crews working to a fixed schedule. It was drained, flushed, and serviced by people who actually followed the manual to the letter. Under those disciplined conditions, the sheet metal miracle held together beautifully, and it built a spotless reputation inside the armed forces. Powell Crosley saw those wartime engines and understood instantly what he was looking at. Here, at last, was the power plant for the car he had been trying to build for his entire adult life. Light enough to make a genuinely tiny car feel quick and alive, cheap enough to manufacture in real volume, and modern enough, with that overhead camshaft, to look like the future rather than a toy. So when the war finally ended and a car-starved America was desperate for anything new with 4 wheels, Crosley was ready to move before almost anyone else in the industry. In 1946, the Postwar Crosley arrived, and this time it carried the Cobra engine under the hood. And for one brief shining stretch, it genuinely looked as though Powell Crosley had finally been proven right about everything, because the cars actually sold. In 1948, Crosley built somewhere in the range of 25,000 to 29,000 automobiles in a single year. For a tiny independent automaker going head-to-head against the full crushing weight of Detroit, that was a real and remarkable triumph. Crosley offered sedans, convertibles, station wagons, even a little pickup. The cars weighed only around 1,100 to 1,400 pounds and rode on a wheelbase of roughly 80 inches. You could get genuine fuel economy at a moment in history when nobody else in America was even trying. Powell Crosley, the man who had shrunk the radio in the refrigerator, appeared to be right on the verge of shrinking the American car itself. But something had already begun going quietly wrong, in driveways all across the country. And the very thing that had made this engine a miracle was, at that exact moment, beginning to kill it. Here is the fatal flaw that nobody at Crosley fully reckoned with, and it lived deep inside the block itself. That beautiful brazed construction meant the engine was built from dissimilar metals fused directly together, thin steel and copper, all wrapped around narrow passages where the engine's coolant flowed. Inside a chemistry lab or a well-run military depot, that combination is perfectly fine. But in the real, careless world of a 1948 car owner, it was a slow-motion catastrophe waiting to happen, because ordinary people simply did not treat their cars the way the army treated its equipment. They filled the cooling system with whatever water came out of the nearest tap. Hard water, mineral-heavy water, sometimes just plain creek or ditch water in a pinch. They skipped the antifreeze to save a few dollars. They let the system sit stagnant for months. And when you combine water with two dissimilar metals inside one sealed vessel, you create the conditions for an electrical reaction, electrolysis, galvanic corrosion. The metals, very literally, begin to eat one another from within. Now, in a thick cast iron block, you have an enormous reserve of metal to lose before any of that ever begins to matter. You could let one corrode slowly for years and never even notice. But the Cobra's entire genius was that it was thin. Those delicate sheet metal water jackets had almost nothing to give away. So the very same corrosion that a heavy cast iron engine would happily shrug off for a decade would chew straight through a Cobra's water passages in a small fraction of that time. The engine would spring internal leaks. Coolant and combustion gases would meet in places they were never supposed to touch. And the brilliant little miracle motor would overheat, seize, and die. And this was not happening to one unlucky owner in 1,000. It was happening across the fleet, out in the field, to trusting customers who had believed in the brand. A man buys himself a clever little Crosley, drives it happily for a while, and then watches the engine rot out from the inside. He tells his neighbor over the fence. His neighbor tells the fellow at the diner. The mechanic in town starts openly warning people away from the things. And in the automobile business, that specific kind of word of mouth is a death sentence, because it travels faster than any advertising budget on earth can ever hope to outrun. Now, in fairness to the engineers, this is exactly the kind of failure that looks blindingly obvious in hindsight and was genuinely very hard to see coming. The engine had a spotless wartime record behind it. Under proper maintenance, it truly was reliable. The failure only revealed itself at massive scale, out in the hands of ordinary owners doing ordinary, careless, human things. It was a failure of the real world, not of the test bench. And those are the hardest failures of all to predict before they happen. And here is where the story gets worse. Crosley actually figured out the fix. In 1949, the company abandoned the brazed sheet metal block entirely and introduced a redesigned version known as the CIBA, the cast iron block assembly. Same fundamental engine, same overhead camshaft, same little four-cylinder layout. But now the block was made of honest cast iron, heavier certainly, but durable, and above all, resistant to the corrosion that had been eating its predecessor alive. By almost every account, the cast iron Cobra was a genuinely tough and reliable little engine, but it arrived too late. The damage was already done and could not be undone. The name Cobra, which had once been a proud badge of clever engineering, had already curdled into a warning. Tens of thousands of the original brazed engines were still out there in the world, still failing, and every single failure was one more customer quietly telling the next one to stay away. Crosley had solved the engineering problem and lost the reputation war in the very same breath. And the corrosion disaster was not even the company's only self-inflicted wound. Crosley had gambled on being first with advanced technology in other places too. The company fitted some of its cars with four-wheel disc brakes, making it one of the very first American automakers ever to do so. Brilliant on paper. But in practice, the primitive discs of that era corroded and seized up in road salt and grime, and Crosley was eventually forced to retreat all the way back to conventional drum brakes. The pattern was becoming painfully, almost tragically clear. Crosley kept reaching for the future, and the future kept punishing the company for arriving too early. The engine that had rotted from the inside now had an entire company rotting around it, for reasons that no block, cast iron or brazed, could ever hope to cure. The company died. The engine simply refused to. By the early 1950s, the numbers had collapsed. The corrosion reputation, the buyers fleeing toward big cars, the razor-thin margins on a deliberately cheap product, all of it compounded at once. And there was one more force that no amount of engineering could ever fix. Post-war America had decided, decisively, that it did not want a small, cheap, sensible little car. Post-war America wanted big. Detroit came roaring back with full-size steel, gleaming chrome, and real horsepower, and the giants could build all of it cheaply enough to undercut the entire premise the Crosley was built on. A returning veteran with a growing family and a new paycheck did not dream about a 1,400-pound microcar. He dreamed about a big American sedan sitting proudly in his own driveway. Crosley had built precisely the right car for a country that had just decided all at once that it wanted the exact opposite. Sales fell off a cliff, and Powell Crosley, the radio magnate who had turned cheap and small into a personal fortune 3 separate times over, finally ran completely out of road on his 4th attempt. In 1952, Crosley sold his automobile operation to the company AVCO, and automobile production ended for good in July of that year. The little cars, the strange engine, and the whole audacious dream of an American people's microcar, all of it stopped. Powell Crosley had conquered radio, refrigeration, and baseball, and been beaten, in the end, by the one thing he seemed to want the most. And here is the part of this story I genuinely had to sit with for a while because it is so strange. The engine outlived the company that it helped to kill by decades, because that cast iron version, the CIBA, the one that had arrived just too late to save the cars, turned out to be a superb little power plant once the corrosion problem was finally gone for good. Racers discovered it almost immediately. That tiny, light, high-revving 4-cylinder was a natural fit for small displacement classes, for midget racing, and for road racing. In 1950, a Crosley hotshot running that very engine won the Index of Performance at the Sebring Endurance Race, a trophy that rewarded exactly the thing Crosley had always been best at in the entire world: extracting the absolute most from the very least. The strangest engine in America, humiliated in the nation's own driveways, went out onto a road course and beat far larger and more powerful machinery on sheer efficiency. And then it went to sea. The design was adapted into marine outboard engines sold for years under names like Bearcat, and those engines ran on the transoms of American boats well into the early 1970s. 20 years after the cars had died, after AVCO, after Powell Crosley himself had passed away, that little braised then cast idea was still out there, faithfully turning propellers on the water. That is the cruel symmetry at the very heart of the Crosley story. Powell Crosley was not actually wrong about the engine. In the right hands, in the right application, it was one of the most brilliant small power plants of its entire era, and both the racing victories and the decades of marine service prove it beyond any argument. What he got wrong was the customer and the moment. He built a precision instrument and then handed it to a public that would fill it with ditch water and forget the antifreeze, inside a country that had already made up its mind that it wanted something 4 times the size. So the next time somebody tells you that a company failed simply because its product was bad, I want you to remember the Crosley Cobra. Here was an engine good enough to win at Sebring and reliable enough to run out on the open ocean for 20 straight years, and it still helped to sink the company that built it. Not because the underlying idea was wrong, but because that idea arrived in the wrong hands, at the wrong moment in history, wrapped in a material just a little too thin to forgive a single careless summer. Powell Crosley spent his whole life proving that small and cheap could beat big and expensive. He was right about the radios, he was right about the refrigerators, he was right about the ballpark lights, and in the end, he was right about the engine too. He was simply 3 or 4 years too early and 1 metal too thin. And in the unforgiving automobile business, that narrow gap is the entire difference between a legend and a footnote. The cars are treasured collector's items now, adored by a small and fiercely devoted crowd who understand exactly what Crosley was trying to do. And the engines still turn up in old boats and old race cars, still running, still stubborn, still quietly refusing to admit that the company that made them is long gone. If you found the story of America's strangest little engine fascinating, hit subscribe, because we are building an archive of the forgotten machines and the visionaries who bet everything they had on them. And if you ever owned a Crosley, drove one, or had a grandfather who swore by that tiny screaming engine, drop a comment and tell us about it. These stories only survive if we keep on telling them. I'll see you on the next one.